am a white man with grey hair and a grey beard and blue eyes. I'm wearing an orange jumper and I'm in my grey office. I have been working in disabled access in theatres for 16 years here. So with any piece of work we do, we hope to attract a new audience, a new disabled audience into our theatre with each play that we put on. So there are three levels of what we call risk for a disabled booker. So under the social model, those three risks are a producer's responsibility. Under the medical model, those three risks are the individual's responsibility. So at what point in any theatre making process do the producers and the directors and the designers all talk about the barriers that are created in their play? My name's David Bellwood. I am the head of access at the National Theatre in London, based on the south bank of the River Thames. I started my career as a dancer and then became interested in the technical side of theatre production, where I took particular interest in disabled access that we'll talk about today. And I've worked in several theatres, both in the United Kingdom, so including Shakespeare's Globe, as well as the National Theatre, the Donmar Warehouse and the Old Vic. I've given access advice to the United Kingdom's television and broadcast watchdog, who supervise access across all of media platforms. If it is useful to you, just to explain what I look like, I am a white man with grey hair and a grey beard and blue eyes. I'm wearing an orange jumper and I'm in my grey office. It's a very grey office this morning in London. So we'll be talking a lot about disability. And one of the core principles of disability studies in the UK is understanding that we shouldn't really talk about disability in the absence of disabled people, but sometimes we need to talk about access with whoever is present in the room. And there will be time for questions at the end. So in terms of disabled access to United Kingdom theatre, it's a relatively mature strand of work. I have been working in disabled access in theatres for 16 years here. It's a very specific strand of work because it covers every part of a theatre. So it touches both upon the physical structures of theatres, the physical production of a play, and the audience and front of house piece of work in care for disabled and deaf people. But before we talk about the work, we have to agree upon definitions. So in disability studies in the UK and a large part of America and parts of Europe, we understand the term disability in the form of models, so models of disability. There are about 16 models that you can use to understand the word disability. There are probably 2 to 4 which are used most frequently. Therefore, at the National Theatre, we use something called the social model of disability. The social model states that a person is disabled because of the way society is structured. These are generalizations, but it indicates an important philosophical difference in the way we think about disabled people. So under the social model, UK theatres generally understand that the people who are disabled around them have been disabled by the barriers created in the theatre making process, which means that we have quite a live debate around how to remove those barriers in our practices. And there are lots of straightforward ways to do this. So generally we do a series of adjustments to a production. They're called reasonable adjustments legally. So those most common would include captioning or subtitling, audio description for blind people, and sign language interpretation for deaf people. Across UK theatre, about 84% of UK theatres offer audio description regularly. About 81% of theatres across the UK offer captioning regularly. 87% of theatres across the United Kingdom offer what's called a relaxed performance. Relaxed performances are specifically tailored for autistic people and people with neurodiversity. Access manager or access officer will remove a lot of the sensory environment, the edges from the sensory environment. So if there's strobe lights or sudden loud sounds, they get softened to make a less startling atmosphere inside the theatre. But that's an adjustment we make, whereas some theatres will produce plays that don't have those barriers in the first place. So those are some barriers that people will face before they even know that you have a play on or how to book tickets. And if people can't book tickets for your play, If you don't have deaf people coming to your theatre, if you don't have blind people coming to your theatre, you don't have deaf or blind people giving you feedback about your theatre. The information currently on the screen shows the bits in UK theatre that we can improve upon. So sometimes we need to think about how we innovate to create better access for our audiences. And here are two types of access that we offer at the National Theatre. They are the same access. On the right is what we call open captioning, where we present the script in text form to the entire audience. On the left is what we call closed captioning. So that is an individual member of the audience wearing smart glasses, which are also displaying the caption units solely for that individual. The open captioning is a form of preemptive access, and it's equal access. We will give those captions to everyone in the auditorium without questioning if they're deaf or not. The closed captioning is a form of equitable access. So that's where we give an individual what that individual needs to access the play. Considering the social model and the medical model again, open captioning adjusts the environment, closed captioning adjusts the individual. Both are the responsibility of the producer, and both have costs attached to them, but one of them means that a disabled person does not need to tell us that they are disabled, and the other one means that a disabled person needs to ask us for the glasses. And on the right is a girl called Eleanor Stollery, who in this photograph is 13. She's a young girl, a white girl with blonde hair. Roz and Eleanor are working on the audio description of a play called The Witches, which was a play for children and families. Audio description is the craft of turning visual information into verbal information so that blind people can receive the same amount of information as their sighted colleagues in the audience. It's the designer's priority to give a lot of information to the audience in a visual format, but the more information you give that way, the more information you are withholding from blind people. The decisions involved in theatre design is also a form of access where you can decide who is privileged to what information. Is your set design full of information that only visually confident people can access? Or is there a way of giving a piece of design that is equally accessible to blind and sighted people? And also, if you are using audio description, who is your eyes? So when you have an audio describer, they will filter their understanding of the world, and that's the vocabulary they will use to describe the play in front of them. This is why for The Witches, for this play, it was important that we used a young person as the describer, because a young person is more able to understand what to explain to other young people in terms of vocabulary and life experience. But potentially the most significant piece in this photograph is that Eleanor, the young girl, is blind herself. This is the first time the National Theatre engaged in what we call reel-to-reel audio description, which is a form of thinking in the UK where we look at who is involved in our creative making decisions. Does it include disabled people? Does it include blind people? And does it include deaf people? And the case has an economic position too. So many producers will understand that captioning, audio description, sign language, these are all additional costs to any production. And that's generally because, again, under the medical model, we as a society view disabled people as additional audience or additional ancillary people to the main people we're trying to talk to and engage with. But how would budgets be used or divided if you had a blind person at the center of your production, or if you had a deaf producer? So with any piece of work we do, we hope to attract a new audience, a new disabled audience into our theatre with each play that we put on. And then part of the work of access is to listen to their feedback, because we also need to reduce the amount of fear that organizations have in making errors around access. In the current model of access programming and producing, there is very little room for error because it is likely that you will only have one captioned or surtitled performance in a run. This means that if your deaf audience only have one show to come to, if that show isn't perfect, will they come back for another show in the future? So there are three levels of risk for a disabled booker to a play. The first one is the same as any booker. So if you book for a play, there is a risk you won't enjoy it. There is a risk that your money will go into buying a theatre ticket for a show that you just don't enjoy. The second risk for disabled people is the risk around access. So they might enjoy the play, but if the access isn't good enough, they won't be able to understand the play or engage with the play. So when they buy their tickets, what assurance do they have that they will be able to understand and engage with the play? And if you're aiming for artistic excellence for your non-disabled audience, can you justify not aiming for access excellence for your disabled audience? And the third risk for a disabled audience is to do with wider social economics. So generally, the cost of living for a disabled person, at least in the UK, is more expensive than for a non-disabled person. So under the social model, those three risks are a producer's responsibility. Under the medical model, those three risks are the individual's responsibility. So at what point in any theatre making process do the producers and the directors and the designers all talk about the barriers that are created in their play? You might be very confident in one aspect of access. So it might be that surtitling, subtitling, or captioning you're very confident in delivering, which is excellent for people with hearing loss or deaf people. But then what happens when you meet individuals who have multiple access requirements? So the English theatrical canon, you'll be familiar, is sort of one of the principal writers is Shakespeare, for example. So Shakespeare was writing in the late 16th century, early 17th century. Shakespeare is notoriously difficult to read, and people had to study it for some time to get their heads around how to read that sort of English, that form of English. Shakespeare is, however, relatively easy to listen to. So most modern English speakers will understand all of Shakespeare if it's spoken correctly. And then taking it one step further, if you are deaf, but you're also vision impaired, and you can't see the captioning and you can't see an interpreter, how do we make a play accessible for you? In the case of deafblindness, we revert back to the principles of access. So there are principles around accessible design and how we give information to disabled people. And one of those foundational principles is called the principle of two senses. The principle of two senses states that information given using two senses will generally be accessible to almost everyone. So the principle of two senses asks us to think about other senses we could use to engage our deafblind audience. So an idea might be to use the senses of touch and smell. And the principle of touch was employed in three ways. So firstly, the alphabet can be spelt out on a deafblind person's hand. Secondly, a map of the stage can be drawn on a deafblind person's back, and actors can be positioned in space by touching the individual's back. And thirdly, the person needs to be guided through the space. So if they're on your set, within your design, they need to be guided. And that's another form of touch for a deafblind person. So what we're offering there isn't the same theatrical experience. We're not trying to make the deafblind person have the same play as a sighted hearing person, but it's a parallel theatrical experience. So you're saying that this play is unique to your experience of the world as much as a play I go and sit and watch is unique to my senses. So these are just examples of how the social model informs how I work and how the National Theatre works. And it's not perfect. We still have to make very big financial decisions, which generalize our deaf audience, our visually impaired audience. But the key part is in that loop of information and being adaptable to the new individuals that you meet as you create work. But the other two things it really needs is firstly, the permission to fail. So where access is new or where new forms of access are being created, you need to be able to get it wrong. And you need to be able to listen to your disabled audience and what they felt about you getting it wrong. But principally, it also takes kindness, because what access asks us to do is imagine a place where we're not the audience and we're not the creators, where the audience are disabled or the creators are disabled. And we need to put our kindness into their work because we believe in their powers as creatives and their importance as members of our society. I really hope this part of the talk's been useful. I hope that's laid the foundations for some thinking for you.